Good evening and welcome to H672, and we will for the first time I think in the whole series take up our beloved deceased friend Edward de Bono, and this is partly reasoned out because he's the one who explains before and after the most pedagogically, didactically. He has a very good way with words. And in his very first book, he starts with a little story to illustrate this, what it is. It's a little story from the past. It's about a merchant who went into economical troubles and borrowed some money from a moneylender. And when the moneylender wanted his money back, including interests, he didn't have all the money that was needed to pay the debt. So the merchant said that we can arrange it like this. I will put 2 stones in a bag, one black and one white. And if you get the white one, I will say you don't have to pay the money. But if you get the black one, I will take your daughter as payment. They agreed on that because the worst part would be that he called the police and the merchant would be imprisoned and the little girl would be in great trouble, in peril. So the poor girl is the one who has to drag the stone, and there's a bunch of witnesses, but the girl spots the moneylender. Instead of putting one black stone and one white stone into the bag, he put 2 stones into the bag, 2 black stones. So the moneylender is thinking, I'm gonna increase my chances of getting the girl with 50%. And all of a sudden, the girl's chances of becoming the property of the moneylender was 100%, no longer 50%. And here comes the bonus point. That's asymmetrical thinking. Asymmetrical thinking does not go in steps, and it does not follow certain propositional rules, logical rules, reasonable rules, or rational rules. It is not using that path at all. Instead, there is another method, and the asymmetrical thinking breaks the new thinking and something magical happens. And we could call that the collapse of the superposition. We don't have any particles here, we just have relationships. But as in the same way, particles are connected by causal connection in our ordinary physics, one could actually say in a way that the relations are sort of tied together in a causal connection. Because what do you have here in this causal relationship? Well, you used to have a 50-50 chance, and now there is a 100% chance. So we only have 2 alternatives, 50-50% or 100% versus 0. But the girl gets an idea. That's asymmetrical thinking, not something that's included in the situation from the beginning. And she grabs a stone and she pretends to drop it. And both start looking for it, the merchant and the moneylender. And the moneylender said, I saw her drag a black stone. And the merchant says, well, we don't know that because we can't find the stone. It was like together with all the other stones underground. Then the little girl says, I have a solution. Let's look in the bag. If it's a black stone in the bag, we know I drag a white one. If it's a white one, we know I dragged a black one. And because it was witnesses, that was accepted. So they looked in the bag. What did they find? A black stone. This solution is not included in the original premises. It's not a possible causal effect. It's not a logical reasoning. No way you can reason to that from what you have. And if we understand that, there's no rational way of coming from one to another. We need to have the asymmetrical thinking, the creative spot. And that doesn't include any ladder working. It's out in the blue. But in hindsight, and this is important. In hindsight, afterwards, after you come up with a solution, then you can apply rationale, logic, thinking, stepwise thinking, to explain what happened. But you can never get that way from the original problem to the solution. So you can do it one way, but not the other way. And this is actually what was proven by Gödel. We cannot go both ways, we can only go one way. And this is a sort of relationship that De Bono wanted the whole world to know. But the poor guy, I don't think he managed to relay the message. He wrote about this a couple of times in philosophical journals. He was very, very criticized. And most obviously, when I've been looking at the remarks and the replies, it seems that people are not understanding. Whereas, if we're working with marketing people, they don't express that they understand mostly, but of course they understand, because you cannot sell things by doing old stuff. Selling is all about doing new stuff. If you don't innovate, you die. So you hear there are two different markets. One market for the stability and the old stuff that goes step by step, and that's the educational area. And then you have the business area. And if you follow the rule of doing stepwise, you die and disappear. You have to innovate, otherwise you disappear as a business. If you don't do that, you disappear. Do you think Volvo would have survived more than a year? Do you think Ericsson? Do you think that Tesla, Apple Computer, Huawei mobile phones, Nokia Androids, Dell computers, fashion industry? None of these can sell the same thing next year as they sell this year. They have to innovate. They have to do asymmetrical thinking. And they can't make do with stepwise thinking. They can't use what they have to count out something else, make another calculation. And that's a very important point. If you don't stop thinking, you can get to a solution by using this step ladder. Then you will not understand that. I'm not saying that there could be cases where you do that. Those cases are. In mathematics you have those cases. And also maybe in real life you think stepwise. But that's not the point here. If you want to understand the superposition, realize that there are actually examples where you cannot use logic, rationale, or anything of that sort. You really have to break the thinking process. And you can think of it this third way, think of the merchant, think of the girl, think of the moneylender. In none of the brains, in none of the neural networks is the possibility to adding logical units to come to that solution. It has to be break somewhere. Afterwards, it's never a problem. It's the easiest thing in the world. But before, it's completely impossible. So you have these turn of events as well. It's completely impossible before, and it's easy as heck afterwards. And I'd say it takes some definite time and training to understand the difference. And it's also the case if you are using this in argument, you will be much weaker by trying to upheld the difference. It's the same with discerning between right and left hand. If you get confused, if you are in interrogation of some sort, or even worse, if you're by the police or some bad guy, could be some bad guy, you're a victim of, you're a prisoner of war and you're going to be tortured. One of the things the torturer or the one who's doing the third degree interview is trying to confuse you. The easiest way to confuse people is to turn anything upside down. You can lose your ability to know what's right and wrong. And that's not so hard really, because you lose that very, very simple. It's like confusing somebody what is right and what is left when it comes to the hands. And think about turning a card backwards, retrograding. If you want to back into a corner somewhere, you have to do the opposite, and it's very tough. It's the same with this. If you're up in a discussion, you are likely to lose it. It's not one of the firmest concepts. But you need to get good at keeping that difference, because you need that to understand quantum physics. And if you can't separate between these two, quantum physics will become classical physics. There's no doubt about that. Everything is going to be determined by the initial conditions. It's a big difference. So De Bono calls logic a tool that you cannot use for producing new stuff, but it's very, very good communicating tool, to communicate something. How did I go about? What is the purpose of the thing I invented? Also like chatting. You are bragging, what did you do? And then you explain it. But nota bene, this will not help the other person to make the same thing, because the thing is already done. It's just going to be a copy. And one thing that is very easy to think is that if I copy that, I can invent other stuff. No, you cannot. Can only be used one time. And that's to explain something that already happened. So it's a double mistake to do that. It was not the method used to get to the goal, and it can never be used to get to the goal. There are different lists there, different research papers, but in academia, 85% think you can go back to where you started and go the other direction as well with logic or rationale. Whereas engineers, to a much lesser degree, think that's possible. Maybe because they had an experience of doing asymmetrical thinking themselves. And it's a little bit like this. You don't know it, you don't know it, you don't know it, you don't know it. And then one day, all of a sudden, you know it. And the change is almost instantaneous. And that means you discovered something completely new. Something that probably never existed in this world. De Bono writes like this in an article named Why We Need New Thinking About Thinking. And it's called Logic and Perception. And be careful here, he's using perception in a much broader sense than we usually use that word. Perception is almost like experience. Feeling plus perception, maybe something like that. It starts like this. Everyone knows that logic is the basis of good thinking. But is it? Bad logic makes for bad thinking. That is clear. So good logic makes for good thinking. Unfortunately, this does not follow at all. Every junior logician knows that logic can never be any better than the starting premises or perceptions. All logicians learn this, then many of them promptly forget it. There is a fault in your computer. Whatever you put in, the output is always rubbish. The fault is put right and the computer now works flawlessly. If you put in good data, you get good answers. If you put in bad data, you get bad answers back. It's the same with logic. Like the computer, logic is a servicing mechanism to service the data and the perceptions we are using. We should therefore be quick to point out bad logic, but slow to accept the conclusion of good logic, because the perceptions may be inadequate. And this is a little bit like Gödel. We don't know if what we calculate actually follows from the premises. But if they don't, then we know they don't. So we can discard logic, but we can't fully embrace good logic. We need to be very careful with arguments. And because perception is so very important a part of thinking, it is surprising that we persist in believing that logic is the basis of thinking. This arises from our reactive thinking habits. Reactive. They are afterwards. We react. And I think this could be a very good clue to what De Bono thinks about regular thinking. We earlier pointed out his metaphor, his analogy with the sandbox, how a drizzle comes over the sandbox, and in the beginning all the drops are running in all ways, all different directions, but after a while you have a little stream, and then you get a river, and it gets stronger and stronger. And what this water leader are doing, they are making the drops go a certain way, and you get a landscape, and that's also called pattern recognition. So they go into different slides, almost like if you have a limited number of birds outside your house and you want to check out which bird it is, and you only see part of it. It looks yellow, it has to be blåmes or something of the sort. It falls into that river. It will never fall into the river of the crow because it doesn't have a gray color, it's not that big, and other reasons. You can see the importance of this, and this system is passive. This system always exists. It's the default. The default is meaning if you don't do anything at all, this system is still working. It's a passive intellectual system. Animals have this as well. But we have something more. We can break the patterns. And this, De Bono called asymmetrical thinking, the breakage. And the breakage is the starting point of something new. You need to actively break. You need to put in maybe a chance word or chance concept. Or you can do as we have done here, mixing subjects. That could be a very good starting point for new thinking. But if we don't do that, we will automatically react in the same way. That's passive thinking. It's a little bit similar, as we've been talking before, about the theorien, sitting in the theater, observing. It has its virtue, but we need to do more, because we have to think new if we're going to have some action. We cannot make decisions based on previous things. We can use them as a background, we can check them out if they are sound, but we can't use them to get further. And that's a very, very important point made by De Bono. It's half genius, actually. Very few of Western philosophers have ever gotten this far. I think Derrida was almost there, and so was Heidegger. But apart from that, I can't see anyone thinking about this, that there are two modes of being. One mode that everything is regulated and causal, logical, linguistically, language-oriented, semantical and all that, and the other one's not. It's just complete asymmetry, breaking of the rules. And on top of that, De Bono means that these two things goes hand in hand. First you break the logic, you invent something new, and then you need to sort of translate that into logic. And now you also see easier why it's so easy to fall into the trap of thinking logic was there all the time. It wasn't. There wasn't any logic from the beginning. It's going to be there afterwards. The analogy with Roger Federer is obvious here. What we see afterwards is that's him hitting the ball and it's going to the other player, and the other player misses it and he hits a point. It looks that way afterwards. And that afterwards can be before. Doesn't have to be temporally afterwards, but it has to be after observation or an assumed observation. But before that, anything can happen. We cannot go from a stated fact that Roger Federer makes the superposition to collapse to that was always the case. It was bound for him to hit the ball. Listen, doesn't this sound like nonsense? He was bound to hit the ball. That was determined from the starting point. We know by heart that is complete nonsense. But still, that is how classical physics works. They come up with this ludicrous idea, everything was determined from the beginning, and he was bound to hit the ball. How could you be a tennis player if you think that? It doesn't take any sensible factors into play. Actually, what it does is to say, this is how it is, and I don't give any care. I don't give one zero. I don't care about perception, I don't care about observation. I say, it was determined. How, I don't know, but I just know it. I can't prove it. That was determined from the beginning. And we all have to believe that. I'd say, oddly enough, and I don't think De Bono know anything about quantum physics, but he's questioning one of the most important tenets in ordinary logic, classical logic. He keeps classical logic, but he makes it paraconsistent. It's only classical in hindsight, afterwards. But in the actual proposition making, the syllogism, it's open, still open. So he's a smart fellow. He was thinking out quantum physics without knowing anything about it, in a way. Well, he served us a very great purpose, but he comes with the best explanation so far. What is this? After and before. Important tools. He also says that logic has to do with perception, how we perceive something to be, and that is afterwards. Whereas asymmetry and creative thinking is action-laden, full with action. He also adds that what he called this passive system that thinks by itself, like do some sort of thinking when the water drips are drizzling down into the sandbox and creates these patterns, that looks like thinking. And he admits that is a sort of thinking, but it's passive thinking. It's reactive thinking. But he also adds that any self-organizing system has a necessity for creativity. And that's it needs to survive somehow. Because we are not sandboxes. A sandbox survives only because it has a master, the owner, or a need. Some children goes into the sandbox. And maybe the parents of the children are the owner of the sandbox. So it's a separated object. But we human beings, we need to survive. When in order to survive, we need to innovate. That's very, very important. Otherwise, we won't be there to be passive recipients of reality. And that's the reason we need to be creative. And he asks loud and clear, why have we not paid serious attention to creative thinking, when this type of thinking is so obviously a key part of thinking for improvement, for design, for problem solving, for change, for new ideas, etc. I would say creativity also is very important for old ideas, because you need to be able to support those in a new way. And there is an assumption from me as reader of the text that some things are not movable, the concepts, the old thinking. But I'd say even the old thinking is movable, needs to have the energy from creative thinking. We need to look at the past in creative ways all the time. Otherwise, it will be a very bland past. So this is what I would call reinterpretation. And for that, we need creativity. We need to put new energy into the old stuff. So as it seems, we need creativity for both innovate things and also to put some new energy into old things. A little bit like Dick Harrison did with Jesus, maybe, or the other researchers. They found some new stuff. Creative thinking maybe was part of it to some extent. And it's exactly that creative thinking that puts the energy into the whole stuff. Otherwise, it will be a sort of a bland repetition, a copy of some sort. And that is also an antidote from this regular mistake. I just looked a little bit on the internet and I tried to see what do people think about creativity. And it is a bit like this. If you do not understand the difference between before and after, you are bound to mix them. And then you are bound to hurt your creativity. Because then you're going to mix in logic into the asymmetrical thinking. And that is always going to hurt the solution. You need to be asymmetric because you are breaking the rivers. You are breaking the little stream. Those needs to be broken for a second. And I'd say this asymmetrical nature of patterns is also what we have when it comes to time, quantum physical time. Some people like Wheeler says time doesn't exist. It's because we already defined in Newton time as being something that is bipolar, bidirectional, I mean. But you could say bipolar, going both ways somehow. It's bidirectional, it goes both ways. It needs to go both ways to make the equations work. And when we don't have a time that don't go both ways, we don't have time. It makes sense. But how about this? Could time be something that is inherently asymmetrical? It's not bidirectional. It always only goes one way. And this is something I've been thinking when you study De Bono, his asymmetrical process, because you can never go back, not even in theory. And this impossibility of going back looks like the time we used to have before Newton. People did not say that time could go backwards before him. And I think that's maybe the most important traits in proper time. It doesn't go backwards. And neither does creativity. Creativity is going with the time. It could also be that time is creativity. Because if you don't have creativity, it's very hard to talk about time. Because in that case, you just have what you have from the start. It could be that determinism is not time at all. How could it be done? If everything is governed by initial conditions, in a way you're already by the goal at the instant you put the initial conditions down. Starting point and end point are not the same. There are two different points, completely different. And our ordinary logic makes them similar. And that is very confusing for thinking. So we need to have some organization in thinking. We need to think forward. It needs to be a goal in thinking. That we need. That sort of discipline we need. We need to know what we should do with our thinking. And then we can start with a working process. Lay down the foundation carefully, meticulously, and then you break it. After it's broken, you interpret it. And that's ex posteriori. Afterwards, you observe it. And by observing it, you can almost say it can't go back anymore. Once observed, it's observed. You can hear here, what I mean by observance is much more than just looking at the thing. Observance is determining. And this is what we human beings do. We determine things. And then they can no longer go back to where they were before. So there are some interesting similarities between Edward de Bono and quantum mechanics. But that was not the only point I wanted to make here. I also say, trying to relay the important need for both having the square part. I call this the square part. The square part is looking backwards. This is hindsight. You get the square part, logical part. This is the solution. That's the new thing, creativity. Both things are needed. They are a little bit like the yin and yang of reality. Almost. Henry asked today, we had a podcast, the other channel, where we have to put a link so we can connect the channels. But Henry asked, is it the same as implicit and explicit? Almost. Not really. But it's going that way. Don't make an equal sign between the two, please. Because there are differences. But if it helps you in the beginning, you can think that. But then you need to make your corrections to see that it's not really the same thing. What is before is, of course, like the implicit, not determined. But it is something else. It's a temporal place that is strictly before. And in the creative process, when we break it, we give energy to the system, we invent something. And this invention is thinking. This is what thinking actually does. This is proper thinking. Passive thinking is what I say, it's passive. It's just reactive thinking. And we've been doing way too much reactive thinking in the Western world. And you can also say that we know that, we've been knowing that, and we think it's completely boring and useless. So what do we do instead? Well, instead of trying to fix the problem, almost like Plato, we went even more in the same direction. By taking away root learning, we actually take away one of the disciplines that are necessary for creative thinking, because that is also something de Bono takes out. Without discipline, we cannot have asymmetrical thinking. Without an order, there's no order to break. And that's the big problem, how we see creativity in the ordinary world. We think it's just some sort of chaos. No, it doesn't work that way. In order to come to a new solution, you need very, very strict order. Everything has to be settled down. And the more it's settled down, the bigger jump the creative jump will be. The asymmetrical thinking is only as strong as the foundations you put down. But going out into the world and think you can start with nothing and just be creative, that doesn't work. And de Bono calls this the dream of the artists. That this is the idea that authors, painters, composers, philosophers, I don't know, medical inventors, technical inventors like Edison. Edison is a very good example. We usually think that creative people, they just go out in the woods and start yodeling or whistling, and all of a sudden they come up with fantastic solutions. Not at all. They are hugely disciplined people, especially Edison. If you went into his workshop, you'd see every tool meticulously placed down on the toolbox. Everything was in perfect order. And that's a necessity to break the order. First, you need to establish order, and then you can have asymmetrical thinking. And then at the end, you have a sort of order again. You have the explanation, you have the logic. So he's doing two things in one go, De Bono. He says discipline is enormously important. And we need to know things by heart as well. Otherwise, we cannot bring the stuff into the asymmetrical thinking. So we need a firm worldview, we need to have rules, we need to have discipline, we need to do it in a specific order as well. And then we break the whole part. This is exactly the same if we want to listen to a joke. Persons that are very good at telling jokes, they would tell the joke as it was real, with a lot of emotions, with things in the story that sounds real, rings a bell, and that it gets the listener into the mood, in the ordering. That's the whole idea with a story. And then comes the punchline, and that needs to be timed. All those things goes into a good joke. But if you can't establish a reality in the beginning, the punchline won't work. There's going to be a mixture of the both things. We need to have specific divisions. And it's often the case, a good storyteller that doesn't tell jokes, but is very good at conveying a good story, very often does not fail with a good joke as well. Maybe it's only the timing he needs to add, but the beginning of every good joke is a very lively story that drags you into the story, so it can be broken. If you're not dragged into the story, it cannot be broken. We all heard these people at parties who destroy all the jokes. Some destroy them by telling the point too early, and somebody saying indications of where it's going to break. But the third category doesn't describe the situation beforehand accurately enough, and therefore it doesn't feel real to you. And therefore you don't have the surprise. Do I make any sense? I hope so. Well, I think we had just about enough for this today. I might get back to De Bono. He has a book that I downloaded called Water Logic. It's rather complicated, but it's a fantastic way at looking at logic. There you can combine asymmetry and logic in one go. It's called Water Logic. I really like it in one way. But more about that in a couple of days, I think. Well, time to hit the sack. I say thank you very much, and I wish you all a pleasant night.